Hello again, it's Dr. Guthrie. We're back finishing up our church history seminar. Eric and I realize we've been doing this for almost 2.5 years. We've done the whole New Testament, the whole Old Testament, and we've done this brief church history thing to give you all a taste of church history. We're coming down to the last 3 lessons. This one is about the English Reformation. If you remember, we covered the Reformation starting with Martin Luther, with the Catholic Reformation, Calvin and the Radical Reformers, etc. The English Reformation is totally different. It's an interesting point to grasp that the Reformation really began with Luther as a theological dispute. What did it mean to be a Christian? What do you have to do to be a Christian, etc.? And as the theological dispute evolved, they were able to bring in and utilize the political forces around them that certain German princes of their German states, like Saxony, protected the Luther and the Reformation and allowed it to happen. Certain other areas, it was different. In Switzerland, it was the democratic states that allowed Zwingli and Calvin to do their reformations, and as did the Dutch states allow them. English Reformation was exactly the opposite. It is basically a political reformation, also economic, because politics and money are always wrapped up together. And it really wasn't done theologically from the beginning, and so they had to fight over the theological issues for a couple hundred years afterwards and resolve their own accommodation between the various theological forces. So it's very, very different. So a lot of this is going to be more political in history, but that's what happened in this one. So it's totally different. It starts with Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII was in the early 1500s, and his father, Henry VII, Henry Tudor, had won this 35-year civil war over who was going to get to be king between the houses of York and Lancaster, called the War of the Roses. You may have heard about it. And so Henry VIII was and that war came out of an unclear line of succession over who had the best dynastic or genetic claim to be the monarch. So Henry was very hyper about wanting to have a male successor child that he had inherited this kingdom from his father, Henry VII. He wanted to pass it on to his son, and so this was a big issue with Henry. And the world was becoming more unstable. The Reformation was starting up in Germany. You had reactions to that in Spain and Italy, etc. So unstable. So he wanted to produce a stable line. He had originally gotten a dispensation from the Pope to marry the widow of his older brother. I forget the older brother's name, it doesn't really matter. This was Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess. Aragon is one of the houses of royal houses of Spain. They were merged, Aragon and Castile, in 1492 when they intermarried. So she's very prominent, but she had a daughter, but no male heir. And so he decided to divorce her and marry Anne Boleyn, who turned out to be his second wife. Well, so he needed an annulment from the Pope to get his wedding annulled so that his next child would be a legitimate, therefore, heir to the throne. And Anne Boleyn, of course, had promised, I'll have a male child for you, as if she really could control that, and she couldn't. But he can't get a papal dispensation because the Spanish had overwhelming military influence in Italy at the time, and the Pope just didn't have the power to grant this divorce over the anger of the Spanish monarch. So it gets hung up, and Henry gets angrier and angrier. And finally, in 1533, he marries Anne Boleyn before he got his divorce. It's an interesting approach to life. And he gets Parliament to break with the Roman Church, to create the Church of England, and just separate from Rome. And he does that, and then he marries Anne Boleyn, and she has Elizabeth as their daughter, and then several stillborn boys So she fails in her thing of producing this male heir. Taking advantage of this break, Henry uses Parliament to make the Church of England the Church of the Realm. And like most governments then, and most governments now, Henry was broke. He didn't have any money. And so what does he do? If you're going to get rid of the Church of Rome, he just takes all the church's land, all their assets, their abbeys and stuff like that. The churches he used for the Church of England, but you had a number of monasteries and convents around. And they often had very good farmland because, you would, if you want to send your son to the monastery because you have too many sons, you give him some nice farmland to support him, and the monastery would take him in. So 1/3 of the land in England was owned by the church. Henry just grabs it and just takes it. And he sells it off, and this actually was the money that allowed Henry and Elizabeth to build the English fleet, where England became a naval power and was able to handle the Spanish Armada and all that in later time. But he basically took the money and took the land and took the money. So it's one of those political things that is all wrapped up with all kinds of things. It had Henry's ego, it had the need for stable succession, it had the chance to grab a bunch of money, and it had a chance for the monarch to become even more powerful. And the monarchs in Europe at this time becoming more and more powerful, they were able to consolidate their power. So Henry did that. And so you had this, and he set up what was really called High Church Anglican. It really didn't institute a lot of changes. They got rid of the Latin Mass, and they started doing it in English, and they got rid of the celibate priesthood. But the rest of it, they pretty much kept. They had ornate churches, they had bishops, they had a hierarchical power structure, they had the monarch now as the head of the church rather than the Pope. But it really was more of a transformation than a revolution. And so this goes on, and Henry goes through a wide variety of struggles, and he ends up with 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed. Anne Boleyn was one, and 2 of whom he divorced, annulled, Catherine and another one, and one of them died, Jane Seymour. And so he had wanted to ensure his line of succession. He finally does have a male child, Edward, from Jane Seymour, and she dies shortly thereafter. Henry's children weren't all that healthy, and you really wonder if Henry had syphilis or not. People debate it. It's not clear whether he does, but it seems like it with all the stillborn children. And when Henry dies, his son Edward is only 11, and Edward can only last 5 years, and he dies at age 16. He was King Edward what was he? The 6th. King Edward VI, but he never actually ruled because he was too young, and so they had various nobility who ruled in his stead, and Parliament worked with him, etc. Now, Edward supported a true Protestant, and the people who really were ruling in his stead supported a more of a movement into what became traditional Protestantism. That they had a national church. They began to develop articles of faith. They wrote 42 articles of faith. These are like catechisms. Essentially, this is what we believe. We believe this, we believe this, these 42 statements, mainly written by the Archbishop of the Church of England, Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, Thomas Cranmer. And they also developed a Book of Common Prayer, prayers that were supposed to use through the realm with various Sundays, and actually borrowed a lot of that from the Catholic Book of Common Prayer. He gets to, in this time, the people around him who were running the country, in that 5 years that he was on the throne, really began to fundamentally establish what the Church of England really meant. Like I said, Edward dies young at 16. He's followed by his aggressively Catholic half-sister, Mary, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, and Henry VIII. And she was known as Bloody Mary because she was aggressively Catholic, and she went out to persecute the Protestants. She took Archbishop Cranmer and burned him at the stake. And they literally did burn a bunch of people at the stake. But that's what they did. So there are some people who argue that Mary wasn't any more bloody than anybody else at the time. I can't really judge that one, but it's a pretty awful time when they execute people for political reasons, they execute people for religious reasons. And they do these hideous things, like literally burn them at the stake, tie them to a stake and put wood around them and set fire to it. So Mary dies after 5 years. Again, really one of the question about Henry's children always weren't that healthy, so you wonder. And she's succeeded by Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth rules for almost 40 years, 42, 44 years. And she's a very successful monarch. And she's established a thing that you can have a long-running queen in the British system. And she's very successful, and she supports Protestantism also. She suppresses the Catholic Church. There are several Catholic revolts against her. She tries to drive them out of the country. There are several plots to assassinate her. The famous one was the gunpowder plot, which they put piles of gunpowder under the Parliament. We're going to blow everybody up in a session that's now Guy Fawkes Day in November. That's their kind of November holiday. But she's able to suppress the results and stay on the throne. She defeats the Armada with her fleet and preserves England independence and moves it into a truly Protestant country. They took the 49 articles of faith and reduced them to 39. The 42 articles reduced them to 39, and they confirmed the basic goals of the Common Prayer Book, which they revise and update and mandate it throughout the realm. If you're going to be a church in England, then you had to use this Common Prayer Book. The Parliament again confirms that the monarch is the head of the Church of England. The monarch is still the head of the Church of England all these centuries later. The Puritanism was emerging at the time, and the Puritans were English adherents to varying degrees of Calvinism, of the more radical reform elements that had come out of John Calvin, the Frenchman who had moved to Geneva, and they had various things they wanted. They were very strict morally. Remember, this was often a fairly immoral age. Most ages are immoral, but they were very moral in their approach to life. They did not like a national church, a centralized church. They thought churches should be independent, and they did not like the trappings of the high church Anglicanism of stained glass and fancy cathedrals and the priests in robes and that kind of communion that they had. They didn't like a lot of those things. And they're there festering in Elizabeth's time. And she's able, with her talent, to fend them off also, to keep them under control. A lot of the Puritans were more of a moralistic group inside the Church of England, and then there were ones who wanted to be totally separate. And she's able to handle them and hold them off and keep them under control. So she's able to handle them and keep them under control, and they festered, and et cetera. Now, in Scotland, which was independent at the time, John Knox had come in, and he had established a Calvinistic church on a Presbyterian model. That's something he developed. So you had and we still have that here. I grew up as a Presbyterian, but you had a national church organized democratically around regional organizations, the synods, and local organizations, the presbyteries. And so you had a national church, but it was Calvinist in theology, Calvinist in moral things, but it was democratically oriented. That was the Scottish model, which really didn't take off in England all that severely. And eventually, after a very successful reign, Elizabeth dies. She's succeeded by James I. Now, James I was actually James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth did not marry, as we know. It really makes me wonder if Henry hadn't had syphilis, because she would have known she had it too. James I was the child of Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was a first cousin once removed of Elizabeth. She was a granddaughter of Henry VII, Henry Tudor, Henry VIII's father. And so she was a first cousin once removed. This shows how unstable these royal lines are. If you don't have clear succession, you can end up in all kinds of wars. But Mary had been deposed in Scotland. They basically took her infant away from her after a week, raised him as James I, made him King of Scotland, deposed her. Mary ended up eventually hiding in France for a while, and then getting captured by Elizabeth, and kept in imprisoned in castles, and eventually beheaded by Elizabeth in England. And her son, as an adult, had become James VI of Scotland, and he merges the crowns when they offer him the crown in 1603, and he leaves Scotland, never to return, actually. The King of Scotland didn't live in Scotland for all that time, and he went to England and became James I. This is the James of the King James version of the Bible, and this is the Stuart house, and James and his successors believe very much in the divine right of kings, that I'm on the throne because God has put me on the throne. It's an interesting concept, considering what jerks a lot of these monarchs were. I don't really think God picked them out. These sound very human to me. And with that attitude, he tried to enforce conformity. He had to do it my way. So he wanted the same worship throughout England. So again, the Book of Common Prayer gets enforced legally, and the churches are enforced to be under the bishopric, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the other bishops in that administrative system. The Puritans, some of the Puritans flip out over this. They said, we had enough, we can't stand this. They originally flee to Holland, where they're welcome. The Dutch were Calvinistic Protestants, and if you wanted to come in, that was fine. But after a few years there, they realized that their children were becoming Dutch, not English. So eventually they come to America. The Pilgrims in 1620. Remember, the original settlement was in Jamestown by the English in 1607, and St. Augustine, Florida, by the Spanish in the 1580s. So Plymouth is actually not the first English settlement or the first European settlement in North America, even though it kind of claims that in many people's ideas. And the Puritans were there for their own religious freedom, but it had to be their way. They were just as intolerant of anybody disagreeing with them as James I was, of anybody disagreeing with him. So, you look at this and you kind of, didn't people realize they're supposed to love each other when you watch all this? Love means tolerate and allow people to have different opinions. So that happens as the Puritans finally adapt away and take off and come to North America. And during this time, as they're pulling out, James dies, of course, and he's succeeded by his son Charles I. Charles I, again, was a very high church, a high Anglican Protestant, and there was even suspicions that he was planning to try to reunite with Rome, to merge the Anglican Church, the Church of England, back into the Church of Rome, and this sets off a revolt, and people go ape. First in Scotland, even though it was in England, that was still under the same monarch. In Northern Ireland, they start a revolt against him, and this spreads, and it goes on for a while, and then Oliver Cromwell emerges, and he's a person who turns out to be a significantly good military commander, and he's able to beat the royal forces, and they capture Charles, and Charles loses his head, literally. He's beheaded by this, and Parliament takes over. And Oliver Cromwell rules it as a protectorate or commonwealth, I think the term they used. Basically, he just replaced and put himself on as the king, even though he didn't call himself king, and Parliament ran the country. Cromwell dies after about 7 or 8 years, and his followers become more extreme. You had to do this, you had to do this, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. It basically was a Protestant puritanical government. And the people get restive with this because eventually they were going to ban Christmas Day. Couldn't have Christmas Day celebrations because Christmas Day is not in the New Testament, which it's not. But that seemed a bit extreme, and finally the people said enough of this, and they basically throw out the successor to Cromwell, who had already died, and they invite Charles II back as the monarch, the son of Charles I. He had escaped during the Revolution, and he comes back, and they call it, quote, the Glorious Revolution. It was a complete swing around from the very hard Puritanism of the predecessor to anything goes, hedonistic, libertine approach of the Glorious Revolution. And again, this wild social policy, a very high church lifestyle, and he's on the throne for about 25 years. He's succeeded, excuse me, by his son, James II, James VII of Scotland, who had converted to Catholicism. Ta-da! And so here we go again, because the religious issues were not resolved in the English Reformation. It was basically a political Reformation and an economic Reformation. And so he had converted to Catholicism in his adulthood, and he becomes the king. And he's only on the throne for 3 years. And the population rises up against him, and Parliament dismisses him as king, revokes his monarchy status. And this is a very interesting point, because you're having now Parliament emerge as the key to central government in England, not the monarch. That the monarch is subordinate to Parliament at this point. So they basically yank away his crown. He escapes. He does not get killed like his grandfather did. And they invite his daughter, Mary, who was still a Protestant, and her husband, William, who was the prince of the Dutch royal house, the House of Orange, to come in as co-monarchs. But they give them significant restrictions. You can't do this, you can't do that. Basically, Parliament's in charge, and you're going to administer this. Parliament's going to decide the law and the rules and this and that. And it began to create what became the constitutional monarchy system that we have now. They saw a gradual decrease of royal authority now to where it's basically just ceremonial. In that era, they still had a fair amount of power. He ran the army and things like that, but Parliament had to approve all this, and William and Mary accept this. And William was an effective military commander, and he fights the Catholic forces under James, and drives them into Ireland, and then wins a couple battles in Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne and another one, which are now celebrated on the 12th of July by the Protestants in Northern Ireland, and basically breaks up the Catholic army, and James flees to France. Then he takes a lot of Scottish Presbyterians and moves them into Northern Ireland, creating this significant Protestant community in Northern Ireland, ergo all the troubles we have now, even though, because they haven't been able to get along since the 1600s. They're not getting along now. So it shows how one mistake a long time ago can reflect all the way through this. But they decide on a different approach at Parliament does at this point, that the monarch cannot be Catholic. They put this into the rules. But they will tolerate the other types of Protestant churches, the Presbyterians, what later Methodists came along later, the Puritan groups. They will tolerate them and allow them to worship in England. But the Catholics will be allowed to be there, but they will not be allowed to become the monarch or have major political authority. So this is all crafted by Parliament in the deal that they make with William and Mary. Mary dies relatively young, of smallpox at 32, and they end up without children. So they're back in the same thing, and eventually they bring in another granddaughter of, great-granddaughter of Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, who's now a princess in a German household of Hanover, and you start this situation where you have a bunch of German kings of England who don't even speak English, the first couple of them, and ends up with George III that we know of from our history. So this is a long and convoluted thing, but they do reach an accommodation as to how to function. Let the other churches exist, but reinforce Protestantism at this point. So it's exactly backwards from what we would expect a true Reformation. This was a political Reformation. And Henry was able to break the power of the Roman Catholic Church in Britain. He took all their wealth, he took all their property, he sold it off and used it to fund the crown. You had this long history of what do you tolerate and what do you not tolerate. You had the Puritan group, which are Calvinistic in orientation, which ended up coming here. And we were left with a lot of Calvinistic Puritan approaches. When I was growing up, we had Sunday closing laws. You still have them. You have a wide variety of moralistic legality, that the government's legislating morality, which is very, very tricky. People often don't tolerate that. So you're seeing some of the spin-off of this, and it's kind of ironic about Calvin's influence, which is still with us, because on his deathbed, his last statement was, "I've been a terrible sinner," which is true of all of us. And I thought, wow, too bad he didn't figure that out 10 years before and maybe lightened up on being so smug and self-secure and how right he was about everything. So anyway, that's the very convoluted history of the English Reformation. Again, it was basically political. They were able to sorry, my cell phone's going nuts here. They were able to make their own theological compromise eventually, and work out the system. And we're living with the results of that now, that the Anglican Church remains a relatively high church. They have a lot of nice ceremonies, etc. They have a bishop system. We're the Methodists, and we're evolution from them. So next lesson, which will be next week, will be the Methodist movement, talking about how the Wesleys emerged, how Methodism emerged from that. And then finally, in a couple weeks after that, we'll have the history of a brief history of American Methodism. That'll wrap us up. Now remember that we're going to be restarting class in person at Jerome United Methodist Church on Sunday, September 11th, the first Sunday after Labor Day, and we'll start at 10 o'clock in the sanctuary. If you're in the area or part of the church, I hope you'll think about coming and joining. We're going to restart the classes up live, probably starting with the New Testament. It's whatever the class wants to do. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.